Okay then, so let's carry on with part 2 of this chapter 2 in CCNA cybersecurity operations with me, Joachim Kävrestad from the University of Skövde. And we will continue where we left off last time and go into Windows administration, or that's the title of the chapter anyway. We will look a little bit on how you can configure and monitor Windows with a focus on security, of course. We'll have a quick look at the Windows firewall as well. If what we've gone through in those part 1 and part 2 of Windows is Greek to you and you don't really understand or feel familiar with the different techniques that we've discussed, I really urge you to do the practical aspects of this chapter if you have access to the CCNA curriculum. Okay, so let's talk about configuration monitoring and firewalls or Windows administration when it comes to security. One thing that I really want to highlight is administrative access. And you should know that when you execute a process, or when a process is executed, it will execute with the privileges of the user who starts it. So if the administrator starts a malware or any process, it will run with the privileges of the administrator. And that's a very bad thing, because a malware or any program with administrative privileges can do basically anything. Therefore, it's of course best practice to not log in using the administrative account, actually ever. Instead, when you work in Windows, you should use a normal user account and elevate privileges when needed. So when you, for instance, run an executable, you will get this pop-up telling you that you want to run a program, and you'll have to confirm that you actually want to do it. That's how things should be done. So moving on a little bit to talk about users and groups. Upon installing Windows, you'll create one user, and that's the local user account. And there will also be some accounts created for you. So you'll have a guest account and an administrator account that is automatically created. The admin account is of course for administrative access, when you really need to change stuff with the user account, change the system, stuff like that. And the guest account is a limited account that can be used by guests to use your computer. The guest account is traditionally a very common attack vector that is exploited by many different attacks that use the guest account to get access to a system. Luckily, both of those accounts are disabled by default in Windows 10. Users are then organized in groups. And what's important here is that whenever a user is placed in a group, it inherits the permissions of that group. So the effective permissions of a user is the sum of the permissions for all the users group. So if you have a common way to work with permissions in Windows, the way you should do it is that you create groups for different tasks, and then you give permissions to the groups. So for instance, if you have a shared folder and you want read and write access to that folder, you create a read and write access group for that specific folder, for that specific purpose. And then you add all users that need that permission to that group. Then you have another group with another permission, and the third group with the third permission, and so on and so forth. And the effective permission of a group will be the sum of all permissions for all the groups that the user is in. One thing that you should also know is that you can set permissions either as deny or permit statement. So if we have a folder and you want a user to have read access to it, you can set the read access to permit for that user. If you don't give the user any permission, it will not have any permission, so it will effectively have deny permissions. But you can also explicitly deny a user permissions to something. And you should know that that is explicit, and that will overwrite any permission statements that user may have. So if there are conflicting permissions, a user have permit permission for something from one group and the deny permission for from another group, then the deny statement will take precedence. Moving on from users to something completely else, WMI, the Windows Management Instrumentation. This is something that is used to manage remote computers. So when we have a network system of computers, we need to be able to collect health information. We need to do some configuration for remote computers. We don't want to run around and do that for every single machine that we have locally. We can do this using WMI. So with WMI, we can collect usage and health information about remote computer. We can also do some configuration of remote computers. And the reason why I want you to know about this tool is that it's actually used in attacks to modify the Windows registry and to run commands. And the thing is that since many networks use WMI as a normal part of their day-to-day operations, this type of attacks usually go undetected by network intrusion detection systems, for instance, because the traffic is seen as normal. And it also usually doesn't leave any traces. So this is something to really be aware of. Next we have the net command, and the net command is a command line tool used for maintenance and for administration. And there are a few different net command tools or net commands that you can use. Net accounts, which is for setting passwords and logon requirements. Net session, which is for handling session between a local and remote computer. Net share, which is used to manage shared resources. Net start and stop, which will start or stop a network service. Net use, which is used to manage shared network resources, and net view, which is used to view hosts on the network. And the reason for why we are discussing the net command is, again, because the net command is something that is quite oftenly exploited, and especially if someone can get command line access to a computer running Windows, they can use the net command. And as you see, you can handle password requirements, you can handle shared resources, and etc. And that makes it a very powerful tool for an attacker. If you get command line access, you can do all of these things with the net command. Next we have NETSTAT. And NETSTAT is more of a monitoring tool. And what I want you to know here is that many types of malware will open network connections to remote networks. So if you, for instance, have a backdoor that allows remote access, or if you have some spyware that tries to grab your passwords and send it to a command and control server somewhere, they will need a network connection. And NETSTAT is a command that lets you examine active connections. So in the example here, I use NETSTAT -B on my own computer, and you can see that there is an established connection from my machine, which is the local address 127.0.0.1, and there is an established connection with some machine called HS-P- some number. And this is, of course, a tool you can use to verify and check what services that have active connections and what services that are listening. And if you use NETSTAT and you find that your computer is connected to weird IP addresses or using weird services, well, then that's a sign of infection. Next important tool to know about is the event viewer, which is the login or the built-in logging facility of Windows. And this logs all types of events, for instance, user activity, shutdowns, decisions made by the firewall on what network traffic that may enter or that gets blocked from entering to your computer. It logs logins, etc. All events in the event viewer contains an event ID that relates to the type of events, and there are also timestamps so you can see when things are happening. And getting sort of familiar with not only event viewer but any logging facility that is used by different operating systems or network platforms are essential for a security professional because, well, this is where you can see what is happening in your system, and one such thing is, of course, looking for weird events in event viewer. I also want to mention updates, and as we talked about a little bit before, no software is perfect, so it requires constant updates. There are, I don't know the number, of course, but I would guess that there are millions and millions of lines of code in Windows, and there are surely mistakes. And there is something that is called zero-day exploits. A zero-day exploit is basically an exploit that someone just found out, so it's the 0th day that it's in existence, and no software has been patched against it yet, so it's like possible to use. And to protect ourselves against zero-day exploits, we need to constantly update and specifically apply security patches as soon as they come out. There are, of course, rules and practices for how to handle patches, because sometimes programmers develop bad patches that will crash your system. But as soon as the patch is live and verified, you should apply it, because this is what will safeguard you from zero-day exploits to a certain degree, at least, because those security patches contains updates for newly discovered malware, newly discovered attacks, patches for newly discovered vulnerabilities, so on and so forth. There are also service packs, and those are more comprehensive upgrades that can include a number of patches, but also new functionality and changes to the functionality of the operating system. So leaving updates, we'll take a few words about the local security policy. Formally, a security policy is a set of objectives that are designed to ensure the security of the network. And many of those security objects can be configured either in the domain security policy, which you would use for Active Directory domains when you have a domain of computers that are connected to an Active Directory server, or a local security policy for standalone computers. And some of the things that you can configure in those security policies are, for instance, password policy. So how long does should the passwords be? Should we have any password complexity requirements, and so on and so forth. You can configure an account lockout policy. So, for instance, it's good practice to lock an account out for at least a small period of time if they failed with typing in the password for too many times. You can have an automatic logout policy that ensures that a computer logs out if it remains idle for a certain amount of time, that sort of things. And this is, of course, something that you should know about. Moving on to antivirus programs, we have the Windows Defender, which provides automatic defense against malware to a point, and automatic defense against malware is a key part of cybersecurity. There are several types of programs, of course, that you can use for this service, where an antivirus is a program that continuously scans the computer for viruses. It does this by having signature database, so with antivirus definitions. So it knows how all known viruses look, and they scan the computer to see if that virus code is anywhere in the computer. We have adware protection that prohibits unsolicited advertising. We have phishing protection that is designed to protect against phishing. Spyware protection that scans for keyloggers and spyware. Trusted and untrusted sources that warns about unsafe programs or websites. And Windows has this Windows Defender installed by default, which is a virus and spyware protection tool. So antivirus and spyware protection in one. Then we also have the Windows Firewall, and a firewall is essentially a filter for network traffic. And it filters traffic based on source and destination IP and port number. If that makes no sense to you, we'll get back to that in a couple of lectures. And it can be implemented in two different ways. Either you implement a firewall using whitelisting, and in that case you define what kind of traffic that is okay and block the rest. So for instance, you may want to say that this computer can use the web, it can play Minecraft, it can use Skype, and that's it. Then no other traffic will be allowed to communicate with the computer. Or you do blacklisting, and then you define what is harmful and you allow the rest. So then you may say that, Minecraft is not okay, this other game is not okay, this other third thing is not okay, but everything else is fine. And Windows Firewall is a firewall application included in Windows. So that's actually it for the Windows lecture, and I hope you learned something. Feel free to leave questions in the comments field as always. I really urge you to do at least some of the practical assignments in the Windows part to actually get familiar with the techniques that we've just discussed. And I'm not oblivious to the fact that this first few lectures of this course is a mangle of information. And for that reason, at least I find it very useful to actually do the practicals to make the information stick a little bit more. Okay, anyhow, until next time, see you later.